Brother asked a very good question. No, but seriously, this is a very good question, especially since I went from being a very much Zionist to being very much anti-Zionist. So this is a very complicated answer, so I'll try to make it as concise as possible. So basically what made me change my mind or change my side was taking a humanistic approach. And I'll explain what that means. So when I was a Zionist, my reasonings for my beliefs were not based on morality or on what I believed was right versus wrong, and they were more so based on what I thought was facts and what I thought was logical. So basically, my basic reasonings were that Jews are indigenous to the land, Jews have a connection to the land, Jews are promised the land of Israel in the Torah, and Jews won Israel in 1948 through war, which is totally legal. Moreover, Zionism was constantly shoved down my throat by my family, my community, and my school. And frankly, the only people I knew were Jews and Zionists and thought like me. Now, the simple answer to how I became more pro-Palestine is by looking at things through the other perspective rather than the perspective I was given my whole life. This started by me making an undercover Twitter account where I started following only Muslim and Palestinian and Arab creators so I can see a side of the Palestinians. And this was also around the time where I started being curious about Islam and wanted to learn about Islam. So I made like a Twitter as with like an Arab name, pretending that I was Arab to see what's going on the Palestinian side. And that was really the first time where I was starting to see things from the Palestinian perspective. For example, every time there was an attack from a settler against a Palestinian, I never would have heard about that because people I was friends with on Facebook and people I knew would never talk about that or post that. So when I had this Twitter, I started seeing the other side of the conflict and how Israel wasn't completely innocent and how Palestinians weren't completely evil. I then decided to go to the library and read about Palestine through the Palestinian and Arab perspective. Then I decided to go to the library and read books about Palestine from a Palestinian perspective. I then came across this book, Palestine Speaks, that I really loved. I really suggest everybody, whether you're a Zionist or not Zionist, to read this book because it's really eye-opening. Basically, this is a compilation of Palestinians telling their stories about everyday life under occupation. There are Palestinians in Gaza who are writing, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, as well as Palestinians in the West Bank. They talk about how their everyday lives and how occupation affects their everyday lives. So really, reading this book not only opened my eyes, but also opened my heart and inspired me to think with my heart and to think through a humanistic lens and to have empathy and to put myself into Palestinian people's shoes when thinking about what's going on in Palestine. Part 2. So after looking at the Palestinian perspective, it inspired me to start thinking more about morality and what is wrong and what is right, and started making me more empathetic. So another thing that really inspired me to make this TikTok was that I saw a Palestinian creator's TikTok and he said something that really resonated with me, and I was like, damn, I have to talk about how I became anti-Zionist. So I think his video was about Israeli human rights violations, something along those lines. And he said, please take a minute to put yourself in a Palestinian person's shoes. And I was like, that's exactly what made me anti-Zionist. So like I said in part 1, when I was a Zionist, one of my reasons for being a Zionist was that I believed that Jews were indigenous to Palestine. And honestly, I don't think that's a good excuse for being a Zionist because, first of all, proving that a people are indigenous to a land is very difficult, especially when it comes to individuals. You can prove that, the tribe, the people, the children of Israel come from the land of Israel, from Palestine, but you can't prove that every single Jew in Israel right now, or every single Jew in Europe or in America is indigenous to Palestine. Moreover, Palestinians are also indigenous to Palestine, and you can't prove also that every single Palestinian in Palestine is indigenous to Palestine, because it is a fact that some Palestinians come from neighboring Arab countries. Palestine was conquered so many times by so many different empires and countries that it's difficult to know what people are and aren't indigenous to Palestine. You will never be able to prove that a certain person is indigenous to Palestine, so using that as an excuse to occupy land just makes no sense. Another reason I had for being a Zionist was that God promised the land of Israel to the Jews. Now, first of all, this is a poor argument, because what does that mean for people who don't believe in God? If someone believes in God, why is it fair to tell them, oh, but this land is mine because God said so? Because that person doesn't even believe God exists. Or maybe they do believe God exists, but they don't believe that God said that exactly. And even from a Jewish perspective, it's a very weak argument, because the Torah itself says that God exiled the Jews from the land of Israel and doesn't wish for them to return until the Mashiach comes. And finally, the argument that Israel conquered the land in 1948 legally. Now, although that is true, the manner in which it was done was really not okay. During that conquest, hundreds and thousands of Palestinians were forced out of their homes, forced out of their cities, and even forced out of their countries. Today, there are 6 million Palestinian refugees all over the world. Moreover, today, Israel illegally occupies so much of the West Bank. The occupation of the West Bank is even recognized as illegal by the international community. I'll make a part 3, last one, I promise.